Good afternoon. Welcome to the BroadCAST webinar series from the UNL Center for Academic Success and Transition. I'm Dan Hutt, and we are delighted to welcome today from his home in Los Angeles, California, actor and UNL alum, Jim Hanna. Jim, thanks so much for being with us this afternoon. Love it.
My pleasure. Good to be here, Dan.
Absolutely. Jim, you know that I've been a big fan of yours for some time. And when I landed to UNL in 1988 as a bright-eyed freshman from Tecumseh, Nebraska, my brother-in-law, Bob Bedell, who holds a master's in playwriting from UNL, told me, you've got to go to all of the theater productions that you can. The program is top-notch. And I did, and he was right. I saw everything for the next several years, main stage and theatrics. You were in the middle of all of that, and I was stunned. I've rarely seen such a level of artistry and acting since then. So it's really a personal honor for me to have you with us today.
Ooh, that's a hell of an introduction. Thank you, Dan.
Not at all. Well, we're going to dive right in, if we may. And we've got some questions here. You grew up in Lincoln, Nebraska. You're a Lincolnite. And we want to know right away, where did you go to high school? Were you involved in theater? And many students are going to hit you right away here with the hard question. They want to know exactly when you knew you wanted to be an actor. Specifically, that's McKenna of Wardville, Colin of Papillion, Jaden of Auburn, Carly of Nebraska City, and we're going to double AJ you. AJ of Lincoln and Omaha both want to know, when did you discover you were an actor?
Well, so the basics are, by the way, I am from Lincoln. For any Lincolnites there, it was at Calvert Pound Middle School, Lincoln Southeast. I did do my first play, I believe, in second grade at Calvert Elementary. And I have no idea why I was compelled to do it, or it was a whole class project. And I do remember that my second grade teacher, when we first were reading this play out loud, and I did something, and she applauded me and said, "Oh, Jim, good job, well done. That's the way you every class, this is how you should do it, with this kind of energy." And I was just, floating on air at that point, like, oh, wait a minute, this is fantastic. I was a very small child, very, very smaller than all my classmates, and to suddenly get some attention and some positive attention, and being a middle child to get a little extra attention, I just was suddenly hooked on it. Now, there weren't a lot of opportunities to do plays in elementary school and junior high, but by the time I got to high school, obviously there's a drama program at Lincoln Southeast, and I was fortunate enough to do multiple plays every year there. And that's still one of my, I'd say, there's a dog wailing next door. I hope that's not bothering anybody. That was actually still informs a lot of how I behave as an actor and carry myself as a professional these days, is what happened at Southeast, because the drama director there, Carol Swoboda, she just instilled such a sense of discipline, and that it's hard work, that it's a lot of fun and joy once you're actually doing it. But it's not just, hey, let's go screw around with my friends and get on stage and be silly in a place. It was really disciplined and hard work. So, so anyway, at that point, so when did I know I wanted to be an actor? The bigger question of when did I think I could make a career out of it didn't happen really until I got to Los Angeles, because I guess we could maybe get to this in some other questions, but yeah. I came to USC to get my master's after undergrad at UNL. Is that dog a problem? Should I move? No one can hear it?
It's okay. Yeah. Okay. All You're all right. Yeah.
That I was coming out primarily to get a master's, an MFA, so that I could become a theater professor, because that's what I started out at UNL. I was going to go to maybe be a high school teacher one day. And then I was like, oh, maybe I'll go be a theater teacher one day. It did not ever fix in my head growing up in Lincoln that I could make a living as an actor. It just seemed like a different world to me. That's for other people. That's for people from big cities or something. I don't know what sort of twisted view I had of it. And by the way, if there's nothing else, any potential actors here take away, like, that's clearly not the case. And as I tell you the story of my transition into a professional, Absolutely. Great actors and professional actors can come from anywhere, but I didn't really somehow have a conception of that. So I came out to USC, wanted to get my master's so I could go off and teach acting at some, quaint college, and that would be my career. And then I got out here, and I started. It was the same thing as UNL. It was a drama department, theater department. So I was doing plays and meeting the kids who were from Los Angeles, and some of them had agents, some of them were getting jobs. And I remember thinking, like, some of them weren't that good. And I go, like, wait a minute, they're getting jobs. And I think I was a little intimidated that I was going to go there and suddenly be amongst that where maybe I was at the top of the game when I left UNL. Well, clearly I'm going to be at the bottom of the totem pole in a top-notch program in a major Hollywood city like Los Angeles. And it kind of didn't turn out to be that way. I excelled pretty well at USC pretty quickly. And I realized, and then I got a sense of how the city operated and how the business operated a little bit. It's like, wait a minute, I might be able to do this and make some money at it.
When you were back at Southeast High School in Lincoln, did you always know that you were UNL bound?
Well, in a way, I mean, I had aspirations to go to, a school, and like I remember I really wanted to go to Northwestern or Dartmouth, and I had good grades. I was a good student, and I could have gotten into a lot of those places. And quite honestly, it was just a function of my family. We just didn't have the money to do that. And so I know that residential tuition in Nebraska has gone up since I was there, but it's still insanely reasonable. It was really reasonable. And I got a scholarship from my mom's employer as I graduated high school, United Parcel Service, and that paid for my first 4 years at UNL. So it was kind of a no-brainer to stay there and so I stayed. I had dreams that I'd be going to, Harvard or some other great place, and it just wasn't feasible for me. And actually, in so many ways, I'm really, really glad it worked out the way it did. UNL was definitely the right place for me.
Right. Jalen of St. Paul and Kira of Rising City would like to know, what was your college experience like at UNL, and how was being a UNL student, how has that impacted you personally or professionally?
I enjoyed my undergraduate time so much that I spread it out over 5 years. I had such a good time. Me too. I could not have been more happy with my actual experience at UNL in terms of just the thing I loved to do most. And when I was doing it was for free, I still loved it, was being in plays. I loved being on stage. It was my favorite thing on earth to do. And so I got to do that several times a year with some of my favorite friends that I'd made and some of my favorite professors, in charge and directing. I'm a bit of a homer for UNL and Lincoln and Nebraska. I can't sing the praises of my time there enough. It was really, really gratifying and rewarding and just fun. I had a great time for 5 years.
That's great to hear. Well, Morgan has an interesting question. She's a Lincolnite as well. Where was your favorite place to study when you were an undergrad at UNL? Where did you go to study?
Well, I will say it's an interesting thing because I took so many theater department classes. There wasn't a lot of traditional studying. It's not like I had to go and crack a book and take notes and study, prep a test. My study would be, I got to go to a friend's house. Yeah, we got to work on our scene for acting class the next day. Or I've got to, go home and practice my dialect for dialect class the next day. For my academic classes, it's funny, because at Southeast, I was on the debate team as well. And we had to do our research at the time for whatever topic we were discussing that year. So I was at Love Library a lot as a high school student. It was the best library in town if you were looking for, higher sources of information for your debates. And I remember just being impressed by Love Library and liking it so much. And so if I really, really had to buckle down for especially like a non-theater class, like an academic class, I love to find some secluded corner somewhere in the stacks at UNL, at Love Library, and just, settle in for a couple of hours. And now it's time to read this chapter and take my notes. And so I like going to Love Library quite a bit.
That's what I did too. Find somewhere in the stacks as isolated as possible. that way. Now, speaking of college classes and the classes that you may have taken outside of theater, we talk a lot about in my Nebraska Promise classes about how students at UNL know going in they will take classes in a variety of different departments, and the value in that is being a more well-rounded person in that interdisciplinary approach. Do you recall which courses you may have taken outside of your major that were the most impactful for you?
Sure. I was fortunate enough in my freshman year. I believe they had just started it. I don't know if it still exists or if it's still called this now. It was called the UNL Honors Program, I believe.
Yeah.
Back in '86.
Yep.
And I got to take a few specialized classes there.
Yeah.
With Dr. John Janavia, who I believe has retired by now, but as far as I know, he's still with us. I had a really interesting environmental studies class with him, and it was a really small. It was about 10 to 12 kids around a conference room table for an entire semester, just hashing this out. I didn't take any academic classes this way, but I also stumbled into writing for the Daily Nebraskan.
Yeah.
I wrote a humor column, and and eventually they asked me if I would write some entertainment columns for them. I didn't have any actual journalism training, so I had to learn a lot from the students who were on staff who were journalism majors and just reading articles to see how I want it structured. And so for a couple of years, I wrote for the Daily Nebraskan, reviewing movies, or I couldn't review the plays, obviously, because I knew everyone, and then they had somebody else review the productions. I enjoyed the English department, especially. I had a lot of great professors in the English department. Even more outside my discipline, I remember philosophy class really knocked me on my butt. I'm a relatively bright person. I am a good student, or I was at the time. I could not wrap my head around philosophy 101. It was one of my lower grades at UNL. It just to any philosophy majors out there, good for you, because I was lost. I was swimming, but I enjoyed the challenge of that. To be perfectly frank, if I'm in a voice or a movement class in the theater department, I'm in my element there. I want to be there. I know how to do that. And I felt good at it. In the philosophy class, like, oh, I have to be a college student now and really buckle down and pour through Augustine or whatever we were reading that I just couldn't make heads or tails of. So, I guess sometimes I wonder if a BA might have been more helpful to me as a well-rounded student, because the BFA, it's I think 4 of my 5 classes almost every semester were some sort of theater related class. But even then, by the way, I was a performance major, but I had to take technical theater and costume design and set design,
makeup,
and those were great for me personally eventually as a professional, just to know how all of that works together. But it was also very hard for me. I was not good at costume design and set design. So
right, absolutely. I've always thought, I was an English major myself. I've always thought that students that are students of the arts, or theater, art, music, that's a different mindset than the business student, or engineering, or accounting, where there are seemingly fewer professional risks potentially, and the pathway is clearer, arguably, in those professions. But for me, that always implied a great deal of confidence in your ability as an artist. And I've always admired that as artists. Is that true in your estimation? And do you have that manner of self-confidence in your work? And along those lines, does that manifest itself? Are you ever intimidated working with any of the famous actors that you work with, or impressed by celebrity? Or do you feel you have enough confidence that you can hang in there with anybody at this point? That's about 10 questions, Jim.
No, you're right. No, I think I can tackle this. I will say that I was always very confident as a stage actor. I knew, or at least felt confident, that I was very good on stage in the plays I was in, and I got positive reactions, and for what it's worth, good press reviews and awards. the Lita Powell Drake Award. May she rest in peace. That was the Comedy Theater Award at the end of the year, and I won a few of those. So I was being told that not only do I think I know what I'm doing, other people seem to think I know what I'm doing. Though, hearkening back to the fact that I did not intend to get this BFA so that I could become an actor professionally. It was so I would eventually get an MFA and become a professor. So I didn't, even as much as I might have been thriving as an actor in that situation as an undergrad in those plays, I never thought, oh, well, yeah, then I'm going to go out and make a living doing this. So personally, yes, I've always felt relatively that I am a good actor. But yes, like I told you, when I came to USC, I was intimidated. These kids are all going to be so much better than me.
Yeah.
In my professional life, because I have been fortunate enough, look, I'm not a star. People might be checking in this wondering, like, who is this guy? I've never seen him. But I've made a living by just popping up in a lot of different places, in a lot of smaller roles, a lot of commercials. And I have been very fortunate to run into some of my acting heroes and to work with them. And it's interesting that I haven't, it's always nice. It's always cool, but I've never felt terribly intimidated by it. The one story I always tell about celebrity when I got out here was, look, I didn't do a lot, but I worked with Steven Spielberg and Tom Cruise on War of the Worlds, and that was exciting as heck, but yeah, it's fine. I didn't go like, oh my gosh, I can't possibly act. I'm intimidated by Steven Spielberg. Or, oh my gosh, that's Tom Cruise. I'm going to fall into a puddle. The one celebrity encounter in my 30 years out here now that I still think back on as the most excited I got was, and this happens a lot in my experience, it's people who were famous when I was a kid and maybe weren't big stars, but I was infatuated with them as just a young child. And there was a show that wasn't on when I was a young child, but it was in repeats called Leave It to Beaver.
Oh, yeah.
And Tony Dow.
Jerry Mathers.
Tony Dow, the older brother. I saw him at a restaurant one night.
Wally.
And I'm like, you guys, that's Wally. Oh my God. And then separately, like about 5 years ago, I did a really low budget children's movie. And the woman playing my wife was Maureen McCormick. Now, the younger people here may not know who that was, but in the early 70s, she was almost every young boy's crush from the Brady Bunch. And I remember when I finally met her, that one got me excited. That one made my hand shake a little bit, like, that's Marsha Brady I'm about to do a scene with. She's playing my wife. This is crazy. So I've had some experiences literally in the last 2 months because I've been working a fair amount, but because of non-disclosure agreements, I can't say them. But I have recently worked with two of the biggest actors who have ever lived, and that people will, that as young actors coming up studying it, these are our icons, the people we go, oh my gosh, they're the greatest living actor. And I want so badly to tell you because it was very exciting. But I remember, sorry to be coy, just last month I was shooting one scene with one of these legendary Oscar-winning actors. And there was a moment when I sat down, I was a little nervous. And then right in the middle of the scene, I'm acting and I'm making eye contact with him. And I kind of went like, oh, I'm okay. I belong here. He's still a much better actor than I will ever be, but I'm keeping up, as you say. I'm just keeping up. So
that is beautiful.
Yeah. That's how I feel about celebrity.
That's fantastic. Jim, what do you think about the concept of college as a time to academically experiment and maybe even get a little bit lost while you're testing the waters and trying to find your pathway in life?
Well, I actually did that to some extent because I think I entered my freshman year without a declared major. At least in the spring before I got there, I didn't know what I was going to study. I knew I was going to go to UNL, and I thought, well, I guess you go to the teacher's college and get certified as a teacher, because I wanted to be a high school teacher at that point. I went to high school theater days in the Temple building there on campus. And there was a scholarship competition that day where we had to do a monologue in front of the other high school students and then the judges for it. And I won it, and it was $500 scholarship. Not a lot, not enough to pay my whole tuition, but to get it, I had to declare a theater major. And so I said, all right, I'll declare a theater major for a semester. Even though I knew I was going to be involved with the theater department, I didn't think I was going to get a theater degree. I said, all right, I'll declare a theater major for my first semester and, cash in on the scholarship. And then I'll probably go off to teaching or whatever. I will say, I don't know. I've only been to UNL as an undergrad. No, I assume this is true at most places. College really is remarkable for that. Yeah, you might have known since you were 5 that you wanted to be an actuary. So you're going to go to business school and that's what you're going to do. But if you want, look, I took French for a while, because I'd taken it in high school and I started taking advanced French in college, and that ended up being a little overwhelming. So I didn't take that long, but you can do so many things. Like I said, I worked for the Daily Nebraskan. I never thought I would be writing for any newspaper ever. And now I worked for my final 3 years at Nebraska at the Daily Nebraskan. I do think it's such a cliche and but also very true. You can make of it what you want. I could have done theater for a couple of years, and if something else sparked my interest, I could have said, well, all right, I've got a lot of my requirements out of the way. Let me go study. I may be gone to the journalism school if I really was stoked about what was happening at the Daily Nebraskan. I don't judge. Well, I judge. Obviously, everyone takes a different path. I took a much more. I didn't know I wanted to be an actuary since I was 5, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just knew I was going to go to college, and first in my family to ever go to college.
Okay.
And so there wasn't a lot of pressure from the family either. They're like, well, you better get a real degree and you better become a lawyer or a doctor. It was just like, well, good for you. Go into college, have fun. That's how my family treated it. And I was very fortunate that way.
That leads right into my next question. It really takes a lot of guts for right after college, right when you graduated from UNL. We've talked about this in class a little bit. It takes a lot of guts for you to really go for it like you did. You left for LA right after college. Was that scary, exhilarating, both? What were your UNL theater professors telling you at the time? And Katie of Lincoln, you've alluded to this just now a bit, but how did the people around you support that decision?
Wait, to go to USC specifically?
Yeah. And to move west. Yeah.
Well, my mom, who is still living in Lincoln, I don't know if she's watching today, but if you are, Mom, hi. I know she was just sad that I was leaving Lincoln. She thought perhaps I was going to stay there. So did I, by the way. I thought I was going to graduate UNL and, as I said, become a teacher or something nearby. And because I wasn't going to the big city to become an actor, that wasn't my mindset at the time. It was to go get a degree so I could become a professor. I wasn't intimidated about that part of it. So the MFA at USC was only 2 years. And at the end of 2 years, I kind of thought, well, all right, I'm not going to go become a professor right now. I'm going to try to become an actor. And I gave myself 5 years. I did and that happens a lot out here. People in Los Angeles, I'm giving myself 5 years. I will say, if anyone's thinking of doing that, any actors who might be on this chat, or perhaps any other hard to succeed in career path, it will probably take you longer than you think. And that's okay. I was the definition of a starving actor for 5 years. But I was seeing enough traction that I was like, okay, I think I can do it for a little bit longer. And then it was 6 years before I got an agent. It was another 2 years before I got an actual paid job, and then joined the Actors Union. And then it was another few years of just scratching it out. I still had to have a day job. I was a substitute teacher in the LA school district for, I think, 6 or 7 years. And I didn't really start making a living as an actor for, I guess that would be about 11 years after I got to Los Angeles.
Okay.
So when I talk to actors now who are new to the city and they want to go, oh, how do you do it? The one thing I always say is, like, strap in and be patient, because you may be the the person who just lightning strikes and you're on your own TV show a year after you get here. Most people will not be. You have to just grind it out. You have got to get a day
Yeah.
job that keeps you alive and that won't crush your spirit, and be patient. And you will quite often last longer than other people. If you have that mindset. I kind of had that mindset. Like, there's other people who are going to try it for 5 years, and then they are going to move on to something else.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can just grind through this, then maybe that was my hope at the time. It seems to have paid off. I do make a living at it. Sometimes not a great living, but I do make a living at it, and just had to be really, really patient.
That's a huge thing to say, that you make a living at it as a working actor.
Yeah, I pinch myself sometimes.
Yeah. I have a question here from Isis of Lincoln, and it might be my favorite question out of all the student questions. You've alluded to this a little bit, but I love the way that she phrases this. What would you tell people back then and or now who thought you should go into a more traditional career to ensure you were financially stable?
Isis, great question. I did mention just a little bit ago that there was no real pressure on my college career from my family, because they were just happy I was going to college.
Right.
I did deal for quite a few years being out here, and I always try to be delicate about this because I understand. I mean, I had two brothers, my mom, and other family members, and I'd come back for Christmas and they'd go, "Oh, you're still doing it, huh? How much longer do you think you can do that?" "Oh, yeah, really?" So in a way, I don't blame them. They want the best for me. They want me to be on a positive career path. And there were times in my first several years out here, maybe it didn't look like that was at all possible. So I never got any overt pressure at all. At least from my immediate family and friends. There's always just this general sense of, what are you doing? Like, especially even out here in the acting community with people coming up, and I hear friends out here, and especially younger friends who are just coming here, and they go like, "Oh yeah, my mom wants me to move back to Ohio and become an insurance salesman," which, by the way, perfectly legitimate and great thing to do if that's what you want to do. So I feel a little fortunate. I got a little bit of side eye occasionally, like, "Really, you're still doing this?" But nobody really leaned on me too hard. So yeah, I feel fortunate that way.
That's very good. Kayla of Grand Island, Frank of Pender, Riley of Blair, and Xander of Geneva would like to know, have there ever been times when you contemplated giving up your acting career and calling it good?
Yeah, earlier today. Of course. It's I don't know how far you want to extrapolate this into any other career, because I know they all have their own paths and they're all very difficult in their own way. I would imagine the arts are pretty consistent with this, that there aren't a lot of ways to make a living doing exactly what you want to do as an artist. There just aren't. And it can be really discouraging, and it can be a grind. Yes, there are times, especially when it wasn't happening at all early on in my first several years out here. I just kind of said, well, I'm gonna stick it out, but I don't know. And I would say, again, because I was a good student, I probably could have gone to law school, and by the time I was 30, been a lawyer at a firm. And there were times I thought, like, well, Jim, maybe you should just, it's not like you can't study a new discipline and become a success in that. And also, I just think there's so many other ways than just like, I like acting, so I'm going to become an actor. And if I'm not, well, then my career is a failure. That's definitely not how it works for almost everybody. You might be a poetry major, and obviously there's not a lot of paid jobs as a poet in this town. There are some in this country. But you find other ways to incorporate that particular passion and that particular training in some other capacity. Like, quite honestly, becoming a professor, which is what I wanted to do. I would have been very happy being a theater professor, I think. And I guess I don't want to speak for poets and sculptors and or dancers or anything, but there are definitely ways you can use that training and that passion to feed some other career path and still as scratch that itch. Because poets might be great writers in some capacity, so maybe they become even a journalist or something. I don't know. I'm just
absolutely like you did at the DN. Absolutely.
Right.
Now, speaking of other career paths, and you've mentioned you were on the trajectory to be a theater professor at one point. Hunter of Raymond, Abby of Elkhorn, and Addie of Omaha ask, what other career paths might you have considered if you didn't go down the theater trajectory?
I really don't have a lot of different answers for that, because it really was, I wanted to be a teacher in high school.
Okay.
I wanted to be a high school teacher. I thought I'd be more like an English teacher, quite honestly, because I enjoyed English and was a good English student.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then that sort of evolved into, well, actually I could get a master's and become a theater professor, which is more in my discipline that I enjoy. I don't know that I contemplated any of the other big, I thought being a lawyer might be interesting, but I really never honestly contemplated going to law school. Trying to think if there was anything, even while I was out here, like I've had the debate with myself over the years, if the acting career just peters out, is there something else here in Los Angeles that I'd be interested in doing? And I have a feeling it still would have gone into some kind of education.
Okay.
Because I just didn't say, though obviously Hollywood as a shorthand, there are a lot of other ways to make a living in the entertainment industry here in Los Angeles. And I do have some facility as a writer. I've written quite a few plays that have been produced out here that have gone pretty well. My last one was actually set in Nebraska because I am such a homer. So I thought, what if I became a writer? I wrote screenplays and I became a staff writer on a TV show. That must be great fun. And I've made small efforts at that. I've written a screenplay and then I don't know what to do with it. I don't know. I don't have the connections for someone to read it and make it. I make dumb little videos that some people may have seen online on YouTube. I make little comedy videos with, they're more about writing, and then I've learned the basics of editing and directing, which I'm still not very good at, but I've learned the basics of. So there are other ways I could have been involved in the entertainment industry that I would have probably been very happy with as well.
Right.
So, but
you've lived in then. Go ahead. Yeah. Sure.
I was just going to say, none of my actual potential career aspirations have strayed much further than education and theater. So.
Right. Absolutely. You've lived in Los Angeles for several decades now. Are you an Angeleno, or are you always a Nebraskan?
Well, a few years back, I passed the halfway point where half my life was in Lincoln and half my life was in Los Angeles. Just last month was my 30-year anniversary out here.
Okay.
I love Los Angeles. A lot of people even people who live here, love to trash Los Angeles. Oh, what a crappy town. Blah, blah. I love Los Angeles. I think it's an interesting city. It's a fascinating city. It's a troubled city, like all big cities are. There's problems. The weather is quite a bit better than Nebraska. I love you, Nebraska, but I don't miss 10 below in January. I don't. So I guess the way I put it now is that I am I'm an Angeleno from Nebraska is what I am right now.
Okay.
I am still, like I said, still rocking the shirt.
Love it.
I'm a huge Nebraska football fan since I'm a kid. It's a little hard to do the last several years, but I am still a fan and I watch every game. And my family still lives there. I go back once, sometimes twice a year. I'm very proud of my hometown. I love Lincoln. I love so much about Lincoln and my home state as well. So
Joel of Columbus, Tyson of Hastings, and you get double Claire of Omaha and Claire of Burwell would like to know, what do you miss most about Nebraska and Lincoln?
Amigos. That's it.
Okay.
No, I'm kidding. Though when I do come back, I always hit Amigos and of course Valentino's.
Oh yeah.
Not to be too sappy, I miss my mom, who still lives there. I have other cousins and aunts and uncles and a lot of friends. I've got, not a lot, but so like there's about 4 to 5 close high school and even elementary school friends that are in Lincoln. And I enjoy visiting them when I come back. And in an ironic way, the pandemic, one upshot of the pandemic, because everything was virtual, I was suddenly reconnected with high school friends on a much more regular basis. We would do a Zoom every Saturday night with high school friends who are now spread around the country. And I also did one with my UNL theater friends.
I was just going to ask you that. Devin Schumacher, Tom Crew. I remember the names. Yeah. There's about eight people from the UNL theater department that we were also doing regular Zooms all through the pandemic, and we still do them about once a month now. That is terrific.
It is. It's absolutely great, because some of these people are people I hadn't seen in regularly. I maybe see them every 5 years when we're all back in Lincoln at the same time, or I travel to Chicago or one of the other cities they're in. But to see them every week has been an absolute blessing. It's been fantastic. So
I still have the programs at home from all of those shows that you guys were in, even the theatrics programs.
Well, I will tell you that maybe some of the names are from, like Steve Lewis was a good friend of mine in the theater department there. He actually moved to Los Angeles not too long ago and is doing, there's something, I will say this as a side note, there's something about Lincolnites and perhaps Nebraskans more generally, because I've made most of my living in the last 20 years doing commercials. Television commercials love people from Nebraska, and I'm not sure why. Because 2 of my friends out here, Steve Lewis and Patrick Wilkins, both from Lincoln, and both went through UNL. You've seen their faces dozens of times as well, because they're in commercials all the time. There's a couple of guys from Omaha that I've become friends with out here that are in all of the commercials. I think there might be something about the sort of just Midwestern face or something. At least a certain type of white, middle-aged Midwestern face that is very castable out here. So that's been, I think I'm a good actor, but I also know, especially in commercials, which are based so much more in your appearance, how you look. Do you look like you could conceivably be a suburban dad in a AT&T commercial? And I guess I must look that way. So I've been very fortunate on just that type, how I look, that I've gotten a lot of work. So
speaking of commercials, Jim, how do you approach acting for commercials differently than acting for artistic productions?
Well, let me see here. Without getting too, actory BS about it, I will say there was a teacher of mine at USC. She was a woman who'd been on Broadway years ago. She was in her 70s or something, a grande dame of the theater. And she'd been on Broadway for years and was now teaching at USC and was on Melrose Place also. She had a day job working on Melrose Place in the 90s. Those of you who were around might remember it, the first Melrose Place. And she was asked about that once or twice, like, you're a Broadway legend and you're now like just a recurring role on Melrose Place. Is that difficult? Is it a hard transition? She's like, acting is at its core, acting is all the same thing. And what you're trained for in your acting classes, it's all the same thing. How to live truthfully, how to, mostly what you do when you create a character is you find out what they want and what's keeping them from getting it. And that creates dramatic tension. And that's what basically all theater kind of is. And what is sort of the germ of a lot of acting teaching as well. What does your character want and what's keeping them from getting it and how are you going to get around them? And she said it's all the same thing. Now, I have to be honest, though, in terms of creating a character, that's probably true. But there are definitely technical and logistic differences from being on a stage where I'm like, I got to bellow to the back of the house. And suddenly there's a camera 6 inches from your face and your mic really closely. And so you can't be bellowing to the back of the house. And commercials also are super, super technical in a lot of ways, because it's not like you just start a scene and play it out for 3 minutes. You're talking to your wife and having a fight. It's you need to hold the product right here while you're, I don't know, you need to walk into the kitchen, grab the phone, and your son is running by, and so you got to get him out. And but you have to land exactly on this mark because the camera's right here, and if you're off, then you're off camera. You're like this, and so it gets really, really technical, and that's something that took me quite a while to get used to, and I became a more castable commercial actor because I got really good at just the technical stuff. Because it'd be like, on this next take, Jim, make sure you stress the third word and slow down on the second sentence. And also make sure you are looking at this light that's coming in from the kitchen window and don't move out of this 6-inch area, and action, go. Oh, okay. Blah, blah, blah. So it's very technical, but in terms of a character that's enjoyable to watch and that people will react to at home, you still have to do the character work. So
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you enjoy the work?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I still pinch myself. I can't think of anything else I would get this much joy. Look, most people have jobs that are sometimes not there. And look, I've had bad days. I had a bad day last week on a set that was just way too long, and COVID protocols weren't exactly being followed, and it was really stressful. But my worst day is still better than a lot of people's best days on their jobs. It's really fun. Yeah.
Well said. Kenzie of Columbus would like to know, what's the most challenging role you've had to play?
It's almost certainly something on stage because commercially, like I said, that we were just discussing, that's maybe a technical challenge.
Yeah.
And to be perfectly frank, my TV and film work, I've mostly done small things. I've not broken through on that level. I'm usually there, on the set for a day to shoot one scene with 4 or 5 lines in it, maybe less, sometimes more. I will say that SEAL Team, which is coming up on October 10th and October 17th. On the 17th, I have a little bit to do on that one. So if you're interested in watching me on SEAL Team on October 17th, I actually got to do more than one scene. I do like 4 scenes, and I got to do some actual acting. But back to the original question.
Yeah.
Was it challenging, was the question?
Yeah, the most challenging role that you've had to play.
Shakespeare is still really hard to do. I've been lucky enough to, even out here, I did some in college, but out here I played Macbeth and Iago and some big roles there. That's just a real challenge just to learn that the lines and to get the meter right and everything.
I believe I saw you and Patrick in 12th Night way back when here at UNL, if I'm not
Yes,
mistaken.
that's right. I was in 12th Night.
Yeah.
Lucio. Was it Lucio? Oh my God, it's been so long. Is that a character in 12th Night? No, that's not 12th Night.
Yeah, I believe so.
Oh, good. All my theater friends who might be watching are like, idiot. He's not. About 10 years ago, I did the play Equus here in Los Angeles at a small theater. A small theater in LA. Yes, that's probably the hardest overall role I've had to do in terms of the character was, well, first off, this character's in every moment of the play, and it was really just a difficult role to get right. Obviously, just the logistical amount of learning all those lines, that's hard. But not to be too corny about it, those end up being the most gratifying ones, right? When anything that is a huge challenge and then you pull it off, it's so much more gratifying than if it was easy.
Absolutely. I don't know if you're able to speak about this, but a whole slew of students, Sean of McCook, Liam of Wayne, Lacey of Firth, Trent of Gretna, Maddie of North Platte, Jake of B, Landon of Smithfield, and Dell of Falls City, all would like to know, who are some of the greatest actors and directors that you've worked with, and what do you admire most about those? You've mentioned Steven Spielberg.
Sure.
Tom Cruise. I know that you've worked with Tom Hanks before.
Well, here's the thing. The Tom Hanks one, side note, was it's an interesting, weird quirk of Hollywood. I was hired to be in The Terminal, which is the Tom Hanks movie from, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years ago. And the turnaround time on a movie script is you could be cast, but you're not going to work for 3 months. And sometime in the intervening 3 months, they moved that particular scene to a down stage in Canada and hired a different person. All right. So they gave me a smaller role for one day. And I only had like 1 or 2 lines, sat on set all day. And at the end of the day, I was going to report to set and like, it's my turn to shine. And some assistant came up and said, "Oh, sorry, Steven has decided that he's not going to shoot that scene today. So you're done, go home." Now, I still get paid, I still get the credit, but so I didn't actually get to work with Tom Hanks, which would have been a pleasure. Well, obviously then there's things like doing TV shows with people again, that like Maureen McCormick was exciting to me. And then I did a show called not LA Law, but oh my gosh, I can only just, it's been almost 20 years. Anyway, there was a guy named Robert Mandan who was a sort of just a character actor in the 70s and 80s. And he was on Soap, which was a show I was a fan of as a kid. And that was an honor. Like, oh my gosh, it's the guy from. So I should be looking at my resume to think about the actual sort of. Phil Hartman. Hartman.
Yeah.
That was a big one because it was my first TV job ever, and sadly, it was about 2 months before he was killed. It was on news radio for those of you who maybe weren't alive at the time. I was super, super nervous. My first TV job ever. It's in front of a live studio audience. And he could not have been loved. And it was with him. It was a scene with him. And he's a big star at this point. He's a Saturday Night Live star. He's getting into movies now. And he said something to me that was so helpful. He just kind of patted my arm right before they called action. It's like, just so you know, how do I explain this? The way that a live studio audience is set up, there's different sets. And one of the sets was set way off away from the audience. It's like, sometimes they don't laugh as much if you're on this set, but don't worry, you're still killing it. You're doing a great job. And I don't know, it's just, not only was I a huge fan of the guy and of that show, but to have him be so decent to me on my first TV job ever, that was still a very fond memory for me.
That meant a lot. Absolutely. Yeah. What a nice gesture. Now, who are some of the finest actors working today, Jim, in your estimation? Who are some of the actors that you admire most? Well,
being a child of a certain age, and then being in a theater department with a bunch of guys who are like, oh my God, it's Robert De Niro and it's Al Pacino. And those guys are still, I'm not going to be terribly inventive here. I still think Meryl Streep is probably the greatest actor ever on film. And not terribly groundbreaking news there, but I do think that. I'm going to draw a blank on any sort of current people. I don't know. Who are some of the current people who are tearing it up? I guess I keep coming back to the legends, and they're legends for a reason. And
the classics.
Yeah. Someone like Robert De Niro. I mean, like if I got to work with Robert De Niro one day, I might pass out at, but
absolutely. What are your tastes in reading, music, film? Do you read more fiction or nonfiction? Do you have desert island books, records?
I've had to sort of resign myself to the fact that as I'm now in my 50s, that some people are going to look down on me so much for this. I don't read too many books anymore. I was never a huge novel reader. When I do read books, it's mostly nonfiction. I'm interested in politics and sociology and stuff. So I'll read nonfiction books if I'm going to read a book. I have to admit, it's been a while since I read a novel because it just doesn't, maybe I read too many of them in school and I got exhausted. I don't know. I'm fascinated by news and by politics and, just current events. So I'm reading constantly. I'm subscribed to all the magazines I used to buy in hard copy. I now subscribe to online, and I read a lot of what's the best way to describe them? I read a lot of magazine articles and some of them long form. In terms of music, I'm so stuck in my time. It's funny you mentioned music because literally the music I'm still most fond of and will listen to the most is music that was big from 86 to 91 when I was at UNL. And I think that's true for a lot of people. The music that was really important to you at a certain age, early 20s kind of thing, is kind of the music you come back to. If I was
About
going to
Lincolnite, Matthew Sweet.
right,
Do you remember?
Southeast kid,
Yeah,
Southeast kid, no doubt.
exactly. Yes.
So I was way into show tunes for a while when I was at UNL, and I would listen to soundtracks a lot. Not so much anymore. Still love musicals, but I guess I don't listen to soundtracks all that much. So yeah, I like everyone. I love streaming things. I love to. It's always that quest to find that good binge that's maybe just 10 episodes. You can knock it out in 2 days, but you watch the first one, and so you're like, oh my, I got to watch all of them now. And I feel like we're always like chasing the unicorn on that one, because then I'll start like, that one was so great. Let me start this one. I just watched one this week that apparently is super popular on Netflix right now called Squid Game. I don't know if anyone's watching that, but it's a South Korean dystopian horror thing, which was actually pretty good. So, if you're looking for a binge this weekend, Squid Game on Netflix.
That sounds great. Jim, a couple of final questions, if we may, before we let you go. You've spoken to this a little bit, but I want to come back to it. What advice do you have for someone, especially in a creative field, in an arts field, perhaps, who's really taking the plunge after school and pursuing his or her dreams, really going for it? Maisie of Lincoln asked that. She's in the new emerging media arts program here at UNL, which really incorporates a lot of theater. Also, Joe of Humboldt and Connor of Syracuse would like to know about that. When you're really going for your dream, what advice do you have for somebody that's doing that?
Well, I will say the emerging arts program at UNL that's one thing I wish I'd been there for. That sounds
Doesn't that sound dynamite?
Yeah.
I said the same.
I was there for an alumni function in 2016 when it was on the back of the Temple building. They'd expanded it out into the whole Johnny Carson School of Theater and Film and the emerging media. And I just remember being gobsmacked by it, like, oh my gosh, these lucky kids, how great is all this?
I know it.
And from what I understand, it's relatively unique in the country. Like UNL is going to be on the cutting edge of that.
That's right.
And that's definitely the future for entertainment specifically. New media and emerging media, that's where the future is. So good for stick with it, everybody. Congrats if you're in that program. I will be honest, there are times in my development as a human and as pursuing a career that I have not been the most driven person. Sometimes I'm just kind of living. I was like, oh, well, even my first few years out of USC, I wasn't. I know, look, put it this way. There are actor friends of mine when we got out here. They're the ones who are like, I'm calling 3 agents a day, every day, and I don't care if they hang up on me. I'm going to call them, and I'm going to, deliver my headshot to every casting office in town, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And there are times I'm like, okay, I guess. And this is not me recommending this. I'm saying it's almost a flaw of mine, is that sometimes I was a little too laid back. And he's like, well, if it comes, it comes. And then once something started to happen, then I'm all in. I'm like, oh yeah, absolutely. I'm ready. I'm working hard and everything. I guess it's an echo of what I said earlier, which is if it's really important to you and you really want to succeed in whatever this field and profession is to go for it with all your gusto, but be really patient. Be thoughtful and strategic, and maybe they've always said, like, actors, the thing that they have to deal with the most is rejection, because most of the time you don't get the job you're trying to get. I go on hundreds of auditions and maybe book 5. Is to not let those disappointments crush you, to not let them derail you.
How do you do that?
I think I just realized at some point, I don't know when, I realized it was a numbers game, and that I had professional disappointments, of course, like an agent who didn't want to sign me. Well, I'm bummed for a day and go, all right. But I think if you wrap too much into any particular challenge, and then when it doesn't go your way, you're like, oh, that's it, I'm out, I'm throwing in the towel, then yeah, you probably won't succeed in the field that you're trying to succeed in. You have to be prepared for the disappointments and to be patient with those disappointments. and to have other interests outside of that, your friends, even just your friends or any other activities that keep you active and engaged and happy, so that your professional disappointments don't derail everything. So,
that's good advice.
Yeah, work hard, but be patient. And the ups, in general, I believe the ups will make up for the many more downs that you will have, because you will have disappointments. But if you really want to do it, then you can't let it derail your dream.
Does it come back to that confidence element again, and just a supreme belief in your chops and your talent?
I guess that could be part of it, because I always, even when I wasn't working and I was struggling and I was trying to find an agent, I always knew, at least felt, I was a good actor. Yeah. So I did kind of think, I guess I kind of thought, well, they'll eventually figure this out. They'll eventually,
right.
The other people will come around.
And they have.
Well, sure. And I don't know if this is true in other professions. I'm not going to be right for every project or every role, obviously, or every director or every casting person, but there are some that I'm going to be exactly what they're looking for. And so you kind of just like let that other stuff fall away. No, I'm not going to be the leading man in a romantic comedy. I knew that when I was 25. I'm not going to be an action star. That's okay. That's not for me. That's not for me. What is for me is, it might take you a second to figure out what is for you, but when you do, just, all right, that's my path. And this is great too. So.
Absolutely. Well, to wrap up, Megan of Omaha asks a great question. What lies ahead for you, and where do you see yourself going from here professionally?
It's interesting, again, talking about disappointments and how you come to accept them and not let them derail you. Like, I have figured out that I am probably not going to be a major star. I'm not going. I mean, by the way, Hollywood is weird, and that's part of the joy of being out here. It's like playing the lottery. I could tomorrow get plucked out to be in a Spielberg movie where I actually have a major role, and I become a big star. And everyone goes, "Oh my gosh, Jim Hanna, and I suddenly have all the money I want and all the Hollywood dream." But that I've settled into this nice. I'm making a living at it. I'm getting to do interesting things. I have a lot of great friends out here and a good social life. And that if this is my lot in my professional life, I'm absolutely fine with that. I would like to, if I had to work at this level until I'm 90, I would take it. And that's probably the path I'm on. That I will just keep grinding away and doing good work and working when I can. And maybe bigger things will happen and maybe not. But I'm pretty okay with that right now. I'm pretty content right now with where I am.
Oh, Jim, I'll just say I've seen most of the theater at UNL over the last 30 years, and I've never seen a more tremendous actor than you. So,
that's insanely nice.
No, I'm serious. It's just tremendously generous of you to give us time in the broadcast series here, and your advice is second to none. You've got a lot of
really
fans
nice
back here. No, not at all.
It's a huge honor for me. And because I do love my home state, my home school, and my hometown so much, it's great to be asked back. It was great to even be asked to do this. If anything I said is helpful to my people, my Nebraska people, I am absolutely delighted. It was a real thrill for me. I hope I didn't ramble too much.
Not at all. To the contrary, terribly inspiring for myself personally as well.
Oh, good.
So, Jim, we thank you very, very much and wish you all the best going forward.
Thank you. Let me know if I can ever help again in any capacity.
Absolutely. Okay. Take care.
Thanks for coming, everybody. It really means a lot to me, and it's been a real treat. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.